All right, I'm going to start and I'm going to ignore your talking. My name is Julian Barnes. I'm with the New York Times. We have a great panel here. We've got two of the smartest members of Congress up on the stage with us today. We've got Mac Thornberry of Texas, the current ranking member and past chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. He's been a leader in the Republican Party on national defense issues writ large, but important for our discussion today, especially on talking about authorizations for the use of military force. Elissa Slotkin is a brand new Democratic member of Congress from a swing district, who in the course of the last 6 months has become the most quoted Democratic representative in the New York Times on national security matters.
Glad you counted, Julian.
And that is because of her deep experience. CIA analyst with 3 tours in Iraq, veteran of the Bush White House's War Czar office, senior Pentagon policymaker in the Obama administration. We're going to focus the first part of our discussion today on the authorization for the use of military force. As you all know here, the 2001 AUMF was passed in the wake of the 9/11 attacks to authorize the war on al-Qaeda and the invasion of Afghanistan. It remains the law today. It's been used by presidents of both parties to take on terrorists. It was used by the Obama administration as the authority on which the war against ISIS was waged. There are many today who think it's getting a little long in the tooth. And there have been reports in the press, including the New York Times, that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo believes the 2001 authorization of the use of military force could authorize the president to take action in Iran, a prospect many Democrats have reacted to in horror and may not sit well with some Republicans. And so let's open this up to our panelists on that very point. Should the 2001 authorization for the use of military force apply to Iran? Elissa.
No. I think it's important to know the history, and it gets very complicated if you're not in the weeds. But in the wake of 9/11, we passed the 2001 AUMF, which basically said that we were able to go after al-Qaeda and the countries that harbor it. And that's the way we went to Afghanistan. And a couple of years later, we passed the 2002 authorization that led us to fight Saddam and go after Saddam. And for me, we have been using the 2001 authorization of military force to go after affiliates of al-Qaeda for a long time since then, including, during my time at the Pentagon. I think the important thing was, for me, when I started hearing Secretary Pompeo talk publicly, in his SFRC hearing about the connection between al-Qaeda and Iran, certainly my ears pricked up. I don't think anyone who voted for the AUMF back in 2001 in any world imagined that it was for Iran. And I think while we can't go into the details, the connections between Iran and al-Qaeda do not meet the definition of harboring. So I do not think so, and I was a co-sponsor of a resolution in our defense, or an amendment that said, no, in fact, the administration does not have the authority to go to war with Iran. We always retain the right to self-defense, always.
Mac.
Can I step back for a second?
Please.
Because this starts with the Constitution. The Constitution says it's Congress that declares war. And for all you former executive branch people who think Congress is an inconvenience, it also says it's Congress's job to provide and raise and support, provide and maintain the military forces of the United States. That's our job. And I think a number of people, both sides of the aisle, take those words seriously. The challenge has been, and will continue to be even more so, how you apply that approach to the kinds of threats that we face now. So I think Elissa is exactly right. I voted for that 2001 AUMF a few days after 9/11. I could not have imagined all sorts of things that have happened. I couldn't have imagined ISIS. I couldn't have imagined the way that the al-Qaeda ISIS threat has spread to so many countries. It has evolved over time in ways that we couldn't possibly. We attempted in the House in 2011 to update the AUMF actually 2011, 2012, to include the associated forces explicitly. We couldn't get the Senate to go along with this. So it is a real challenge, and yet Congress has yet to step up and meet that challenge, partly because of partisanship, and we'll get into that. I do not think the administration or virtually anybody in Congress believes the 2001 AUMF justifies or authorizes a war against the regime of Iran. Now, as Elissa said, what it said in the 2001, against those who committed the acts of September 11th and those who harbor them. And so there, I think that's one reason Pompeo gets a little squiggly, because he doesn't want to foreclose some potential option that meets that test. And there's no Secretary of State that wants to be limited, in what they can do. But I don't think there's a serious attempt to use it for that purpose. I don't think anybody would support it.
The defense authorization bill that passed the House had a measure that restricted the president's ability to attack Iran. You supported it, right? You were skeptical of it. What was this? I've simplified that. Tell me what this measure does and whether it's obviously you think it's proper, but is this a restriction of the presidential's power?
Just to make sure we're talking about the same thing. I did co-sponsor an amendment that said the president does not have the authority granted by Congress in the 2001 AUMF to go to war with Iran.
Would that restrict what he does or not? And what scenarios? Unpack that a little bit for us.
So again, this is all kind of in the weeds stuff, but we always retain the right to self-defense. Always, always, always. And we also have provisions under the war powers to make sure that any president has the ability to go and fight and defend the country no matter what. But if you're going to launch a medium to long-term war and get us engrossed in another war, you need to come back to Congress. That was the signal that we were trying to send. A reassertion of Congress's responsibilities. I'm glad to hear that, I certainly trust Representative Thornberry that he doesn't believe it gives us that authority, but we couldn't quite get a straight answer. And particularly when the Secretary of State opens the door on that question, we felt it was necessary to put down a very clear statement. Because we've seen this movie, right? We've seen the movie where we start talking about the connection between Al-Qaeda and, in the case of 2002, Iraq, right? We've seen that movie. We've seen that rhetoric, and we now know in hindsight it was embellished, it was exaggerated, and it was done for political purposes. So I've seen that movie. I didn't love it the first time, and we wanted to make clear that we weren't going to go through it again.
Mac, if this resolution like this, amendment like this, merely clarifies what the authorization for the use of military force does or does not do, but does not restrict the president's ability to act in self-defense, is there a problem with it? What is flawed about that approach?
Well, what concerned many of us was not just that amendment, but an additional one that was added that says none of the funds in this act shall be used to do all sorts of things related to Iran. So we had the lawyers at the Joint Staff and CENTCOM look at that language, and their concern was that it went so far as to restrict our partner sharing with key intelligence sharing with partners in the key areas. That it may have even interfered with our ability to defend Israel in certain circumstances against Iranian proxies. And so there were a list of things that the lawyers who have to live under this every day said this goes way too far, not just clarifying, but the combination of those two amendments would limit their ability to do some things that they're doing now. And this gets more to the fundamental question that we've kind of been talking about. Okay, when is it war that Congress has to approve? When is it self-defense? When is it, we heard earlier today about escorting tankers in and out of the Persian Gulf. Does that require approval from Congress? What about shooting down a drone that is coming? So that's part of the reason these are challenging questions. At what level does it require congressional authorization, meet that test of war in current in current circumstances. I mean, it's not clear. It's the back and forth that kind of determines it. But the feeling for many of us was that what the House majority did went too far.
Elissa, you've been on both sides, in the Pentagon on the executive, in Congress as a member. How do you see that very issue of what Mac was laying out there of when congressional action, congressional authorization, congressional approval is needed? Is it case by case, know it when you see it? Are there principles that we should act by? Because, as we've seen, sometimes a single strike can lead to a longer campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it has to do with the temporal nature of it. And I think if the president and the administration is going into it thinking that this is the beginning of a longer offensive, I think they need to come back to Congress. I don't personally know that they need to come back to Congress to escort ships or to shoot down a drone, especially if the drone is acting in an aggressive way. And there's no way. You can't do that operationally. I think, to be honest, it's important to have this conversation. I am personally much more worried about an inadvertent war with Iran than I am with a purposeful, planned, and intended war with Iran. And I think, just based on history, we are more likely to get into wars by mistake than by intent. And I think that is, when I look at the combination of things happening in the Gulf right now, that is my much bigger fear, that we will just skip into something. Because people will get their backs up, because a combination of needing to look strong for both sides, maybe some too quick decision making, that we could certainly find ourselves in a cycle of escalation.
So let's drill down on that a little bit and broaden the discussion. What do you think of the administration's military moves so far to sort of try what they've said is to rebuild deterrence with additional ships, Patriot batteries, more troops? I wonder if you both could say what you think about that, say if you think it can reestablish deterrence, what more should be done, or what less should be done.
Well, for me, I think what the administration has done has been appropriate, in the sense that when they've sent additional troops to the Middle East, they have been to man Patriot batteries, defensive positions. There has been no additional offensive capability that they have put into the region. And I think, there were some of us that met with the president just after the drone was struck down on both sides of the aisle, House and Senate. And he was wrestling with what's the appropriate response. And so he pulled back what apparently they began. I don't think anybody can say that he has been pushing out to provoke some sort of war. But at the same time, the idea that Iran can do all sorts of things without any sort of reaction is just going to encourage them to take further steps in order to get a reaction. I think that in all of these issues, one of the things we're not very good at, and some panelists talked about it maybe yesterday, is understanding the dynamics inside, in this case, the country of Iran. Economy going down, some leadership struggles and so forth. To what extent do they see provoking a fight with us as a way out of their current internal difficulties? So there's that whole dynamic. It's not just about what we do, it's also about what they do and what they think and what they see as their opportunities. So making it clear that you can't get something cheaply, as far as military, I think is important. Is there a guarantee it's going to work? No, because of this internal dynamics that are going on inside Iran.
How well do you think, Elissa, do we understand what's going on inside Iran right now?
Well, we've always had a problem understanding what's going on in any of these regimes that are largely closed to us, where we don't have diplomats, where we don't have regular engagement. And I think our understanding of it is actually going down. And I think it's important to look at the context of what's happened over the past year, right? I do think we have to factor in not just Iran's bad behavior now, but the context of the last year since we pulled out of the JCPOA. and the return of sanctions and the economic pressure that they're under. It doesn't excuse any of the activity that they do, but I do think it is important to put ourselves in the story appropriately. Unfortunately, I think we had a moment there during the negotiations where, because they were at one point succeeding, if you're the Iranians, then it was promoting the moderates, right? It was sort of like the moderates were bringing Iran kind of a win. And now I think that is largely being pushed to the floor, and we're seeing the return of the hardliners. And people like Qasem Soleimani, who's the head of the Quds Force, he is a dynamic, serious leader. I am not clear how much direction he takes and how much freelancing he gets to do, but I know that in this kind of environment, he's probably given a ton of leeway, and I think we know that now. I personally think that means we're going to see more aggressive behavior, more violent things coming out of the Iranians, and that's when you start to see that tit for tat. And I think for me, it's hard to understand exactly what we're aiming for, what the administration is aiming for, right? We pulled out, we're adding pressure. Is the goal to get them back to the table? Is the goal to reestablish deterrence and get them back to the table a few years from now? What are we trying to do? Is it regime change? We don't know. I mean, John Bolton has written about regime change in Iran his entire adult life. So if I don't know what the strategy is, I don't know how the Iranians understand it. And that's where you get into real misunderstanding and miscalculation. Something we do that's defensive, suddenly they interpret as offensive, and you're in the spiral.
Mac, will you react to that? Do you think you have an understanding of what the administration's strategy is with Iran?
Well, I will interpret the way I understand it, understanding that I don't work for the administration. I think they're trying to put pressure on Iran. If lightning strikes and the regime changes, so be it, but I don't really think that's the goal. I think the goal is to put pressure on them so that they do come back to the table and, in the administration's eyes, negotiate a better JCPOA, maybe beyond just the nuclear program to include missiles. And in any event, put greater pressure on the regime so that it is harder for them to engage in all of these nefarious activities around the whole Middle East in which they have been engaged. I think that's their approach.
Are we in a hybrid conflict, a gray zone conflict with Iran right now, with tankers being detained and drones being shot down? What do you think, Mac?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's not just that. They're using proxies. They're using proxies in Yemen. They have proxies with Hezbollah. They have all sorts of militia groups inside Iraq. And the danger that those militia groups would be set loose to attack U.S. service members is part of what changed just a few months ago and has led to this cycle. So you have the use of proxies, presumed deniability. You have the Iranian military, the IRGC, which they kind of do their own thing. You have cyber war cyber conflict going on all the time. So there are a lot of characteristics of what we've seen with this gray zone warfare that the Russians have used fairly effectively in Ukraine, that Iran has learned from, and in some ways even advanced beyond what the Russians have done.
Elissa, do you agree? And what is, from your experience, the best approach for the United States to sort of counter that?
Well, I largely agree, with the exception that this has been going on a lot longer than recently. Right? I mean, to me, I was an Iraq Shia militia analyst by training at the CIA. That's what I did. So I spent years of my life, 8 years of my life, looking at the connection between really bad people in Iraq, bad militias, and Iranian weapons, materiel, leadership, training. That connection has been there almost as long as our invasion, since our invasion. And it's gotten more sophisticated. It's gotten, with heavier weapons. We've seen them adapt and apply that model all over the region. So that's been going on for a long time. What to do about it is the much more complicated question. And, the spread of Iranian destabilizing behavior happened at the same time that we got really entrenched in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the idea that we can somehow go through these various countries and root out that problem, take on Iran, or at least have these proxy fights, it feels exhausting, right? I absolutely believe that they should be punished for their terrorism, for their destabilizing behavior, right? I've lost friends and colleagues to Iranian rockets in Iraq. But how you go about it is one of the trickiest questions. And the answer tends to be strong states with strong militaries keep these guys out. Weak states like Yemen, like Syria, weaker states like Iraq, allow them in. So the model, should we choose to accept it or use it, is to build up these states so that they can take care of their own borders and we're not constantly following the Iranians as they move around the region.
The administration's approach to Iran, most notably with the withdrawal from the Iran deal, but other options that have been done, have increased tensions, driven a wedge with European allies who have who support the Iran deal still. There's divisions there. You both have spoken about the importance of alliances. How much has that damaged alliances with Europe and others, or is it the case that that's compartmentalized to that issue and more broadly there's more agreement than disagreement? What do you think, Mac?
Well, one of the things I think that is absolutely Iran's objective with all of this tanker business and whatnot that they've been doing the past few weeks in the Persian Gulf is to drive a wedge between us and our European allies. And the hope is that the Europeans will go ahead and provide economic assistance, trade, all the economic things Iran thinks they need for their economy in spite of our sanctions. So it's driving that wedge between us that is one of their key goals. I think the difference between the Trump administration and the Europeans on whether to stay in the JCPOA did do some damage, but it was in the context of other differences. You know, step up to NATO, we may withdraw from, so there were several things going on at once. From our conversations more recently, I think they would still like to have a unified front, excuse me, but I don't think that fundamentally it has damaged the alliance. There are, I want to say, bigger maybe concerns that they may have about our stick-to-itness and some other things.
Elissa, do you want to weigh in or go to questions?
I would just say I agree with Mac's last point that pulling out of the JCPOA, I think, was a big problem for our European allies. I think it fits into a bigger narrative of a trust deficit that we now have with our allies. They want to trust us. They want to work with us. Having friends is a good thing. And I think on both sides, that makes us both stronger. But I think the way that this administration has treated our allies has created or exacerbated a trust deficit. And it's going to take some time to repair. And it's something that breaks with 60 years of national security policy, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And I think that is obviously a deeply, deeply flawed approach. And the JCPOA just sort of fit into that bigger story.
Let's open it up to you. Let me go first to retired General Dunlop there in the back. There's a microphone right next to you.
Thank you very much. Charlie Dunlap, now with Duke Law School. Two sort of related questions. One is, what would be your definition of harbor within the meaning of the 2001 AUMF? And then secondly, when Senator Chris Murphy was here, he's very much of an advocate for a new AUMF, but he said something, he said he believes that the executive needs to come to Congress, quote, even if it looks like an emergency. Do you agree with that, or what would be your thoughts on that?
Oh, I've got several thoughts. when Paul Ryan became Speaker, he asked me to try to have a bunch of informal meetings with Republicans to see if there were a way to get Republicans on the same page about updating the AUMF and President Obama, of course, was in office. So what I found was what Republicans generally in the House wanted were a bunch of restrictions on our military. You could do this and you had to do it in this way and so forth. They were just unreasonable. So now we kind of have the opposite. With President Trump in there, it's very challenging to get Democrats to update it to an AUMF, to open it up again because of all of the concerns that they have about him. I worry that we have gotten to a place where our partisanship is so intense that opening it up and trying to update it may not, on a bipartisan basis, may not be possible. What may be more possible is to step back on something that is not an immediate crisis and think through how we would authorize the use of force for something like a cyber war. Now, that presents some real challenges that we need to think through because it's not just electrons going back and forth. There can be physical consequences. People can die even if it is a cyber conflict. Maybe what we need to think about to get away from the partisanship that has engulfed us is it make a harder problem, but it's not an immediate problem. And maybe that can help us get back to Congress fulfilling its role under the Constitution. I don't know, it's just one thought.
Yeah, I actually think, I know it's slightly off topic, but I think Mac is completely, Representative Thornberry is exactly right. If you think about the changing nature of warfare, I think we are very unprepared doctrine-wise in how to deal with it. So for instance, I live in Michigan. I represent a state that can get kind of cold. If we had a cyber attack on our critical infrastructure, this year during our polar vortex, we had an accidental explosion of a natural gas facility, and our governor had to get on TV and tell everyone to turn the heat down below 65 degrees, or else we were going to lose power and we were going to lose the ability to heat our warming stations. So I thought about, well, what if that happened intentionally? What if someone purposely took out a part of our grid and 26 elderly people froze to death in their homes? What is the proportional response to that? It was an attack. It was an attack. It was through very non-traditional means. We're the United States of America. We tend to believe in proportional response. We don't go and kill elderly people in their homes. So how do we respond when something like that happens? That we are, I think, very unprepared for. And I think there is a ton of work that we can do together because we need it. And it may be less of a lightning rod than some of the more difficult pieces.
Other questions? Do I see any hands? All right. So let me ask you guys a little bit about talking a little bit about the cyber, but not in a Russian context. We had during the midterm elections some more aggressive actions by Cyber Command, thanks to the authorization that Congress had done. Are we doing enough offensively to defend American elections, to defend against foreign influence campaigns, the kinds of things that professionals have said we're going to see more of in 2020?
I mean, I think without going into the details, the good news is, we've been briefed a number of times, both as the entire House of Representatives and in committee. And I do feel better now that we are confronting the challenges that confounded us in 2016 in a much more real way. So the trajectory is in the right direction. Do I believe that we're protected and 2020 is good to go? No. And I think that there is a ton of legislative work. We're doing a ton of appropriate oversight right now. Since the Mueller report came out, that's a whole category of activity that's going on in Congress. But we actually haven't passed any laws that make us safer than we were in 2016. So there's a group of us bipartisan who got together called Task Force Sentry to actually address that. But I do think that particularly the Director of National Intelligence, and I know he just announced a new, I'm not going to get the right term, I think it's czar or something akin to a czar on election security. I think the intelligence community and the Pentagon are taking this seriously. I was glad to hear it. But we still have a long way to go, and it literally undergirds our democracy. So it should be the highest priority order. I would like the White House to take it more seriously. The institutions, the departments, and the agencies are taking it seriously.
Mac, what do you think?
I think that's absolutely right. 2018 election was much better than 2016, largely because Cybercom took a more aggressive stance in preventing predominantly Russian interference in our election. And that was a good thing. But we should not think that that's the end of the story, because they saw what we did and now they're working on their plans to get around it. So it's a cat and mouse game as both sides try to outmaneuver one another. I do think that the kind of oversight that Elissa was just talking about is really, really important, because I worry that as the military becomes more aggressive in protecting this essential part of our democracy, that somebody who doesn't win the election or doesn't come out will politicize the military in some way. So the importance of the Cybercom coming to us till we're tired of looking at them, to tell them about tell us, both sides of the aisle, what they're doing to try to make sure this does not become political in the 2020 election is really very important, I think.
Critical point. Kim Dozier, I saw, has a question in the back. If we could get her a microphone we got another microphone race. Let's see. There we go.
Hey, so it was widely reported in Britain that ahead of the strike that President Trump ultimately called off against Iran, that Britain got uncharacteristically last-minute notice and has felt a little left out of some of the planning. When the leading ally of the Five Eyes arrangement is being iced out, what does that say about how the Trump administration is handling the issue of Iran? And could the disagreement between Britain and the EU and the US over Iran really tear apart the fabric that undergirds that alliance?
I don't know the details of what was or was not conveyed. I'll probably speak out of school, but I will say that there were the leadership of Congress, House and Senate, Republican, Democrat, and then the committee chairs and rankings of armed services, intelligence, so forth, met with the president when he was trying to decide what to do. And what he heard uniformly from us was do it with our allies. Partly because of what we were talking about a while ago, Iran's trying to divide us. It is essential that whatever you do about this drone shoot down, that we do it with our allies to prevent them from splitting us, and also to because, as I think the president will point out, we don't really need oil out of the Middle East anywhere anymore. But everybody else does, and the global economy does. And so what the approach we need to take with Iran and what they've been doing needs to be one with our global allies. Given the disarray in the British government right now, I would not make too much out of, well, they didn't call us in time for this or the other incident. But through the disarray, we need to bend over backwards, in my view, to stay close to all our allies, especially, in my opinion, our closest ally around the world, and that's the UK.
We got another hand in the back. If we could get a microphone do we have a microphone going to the back? It's going there slowly. But.
Hey there, I'm Betsy Woodruff with the Daily Beast. There was reporting in June that the US government obtained intelligence showing the Saudis expanded their ballistic missile program, and that the administration did not share that intelligence with important members of Congress in a timely manner. I'm just wondering what your guys' thoughts are on sort of the intelligence sharing relationship between the administration and the Hill, and if there have been any changes since that particular episode unfolded.
So I think Mac might be the better person to answer this because I only started in Congress in January. So I don't know if what we're getting is good, bad, normal, not normal. I'm a former CIA officer, so I'm always wanting more. And it has been hard to get information on certain topics, I will acknowledge. I don't know if that's purposeful, but I don't have a comparative to how it used to be.
Yeah, I would, so I've been doing this a while. I would say there are ups and downs, and there have been struggles with pretty much every administration I can think of to get information, and it, as I say, comes up and down. A lot of it depends on our persistence in asking to get it, and developing. This is partly trust too. The trust in various agencies that we can have a responsible conversation, and we will take good care of the information that is exchanged. I will say, you know, just as one example, this was in several of the newspapers last week, where on a bipartisan basis, some of us sent a letter to the Trump administration demanding that they share with at least some of the leadership in the Armed Services Committee the rules of engagement for certain cyber contingencies. And the Obama folks did give us that information. The Trump people changed it, but then they were reluctant to show us. We had to go all the way to the White House counsel, but he has come back and said, okay, we will follow that precedent. So persistence, you got to keep asking, and you got to show that you're responsible. You will be careful with the information, but I don't notice a tremendous change from this administration from the last or the one before or the one before.
Other questions here? We have a gentleman in the back in the white shirt. Here comes the microphone right now.
I'm still not clear why, if it isn't an emergency, or we have been attacked, rather, such as Pearl Harbor, why we don't follow the Constitution and make the Congress responsible for declaring war in that case, for those specific instances, and for that new age type of decision. I just don't understand why we wouldn't want to wait and take the time if it's not being attacked, since we're going to be sending our children to war. And the Congress has a responsibility of representing all the states, presumably all the people, much more so than any other body we got. And I think that's why it's in the Constitution, and I don't understand why we would diddle with it.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I can speak as someone who has a stepdaughter in the military right now, has a husband who served for 30 years in the Army, that I feel quite strongly about the need to rewrite the AUMF. I feel a lot of us who came in new are freshmen who are veterans or former intel, folks who have a background working with the military in some form or fashion. It absolutely needs to be updated. And I think the reality is, if I can be frank, there are really polar opposite sides of this issue. There are people who want to leave zero authorization for any military force for anything, which would be significant upheaval. There are people who want to keep things exactly the same, right? An AUMF in perpetuity. And then there are people who said, well, let's erase everything now, start from scratch, and we'll figure it out. And I will just tell you, I deeply believe in amending the AUMF, but I also deeply believe that we can't put our problems on the US military. We can't take our responsibilities and say, we can't figure it out, so we're just gonna go with nothing and let the military sort it out. We've got 50,000 forces in the Persian Gulf right now. If we took away the authorization of military force, every authorization right now, what would we do? Would we pull them all back by the letter of the law? We'd have to examine that. And I just don't believe in outsourcing our dysfunction to the US military. That said, we cannot live forever on this AUMF. And we have used it in lots of corners of the world, in lots of places for lots of different reasons. It has basically been Congress giving up more and more of its power by doing that. But I believe in amending it with a replacement, not just evaporating the whole thing and shoving it all in the U.S. military.
Mac, if there was a possibility to replace the AUMF, should it have a sunset clause in it so it does not last indefinitely?
I've certainly been open to a time limit for an AUMF to force Congress to re-examine the issue. In this particular AMF against counterterrorism, I see no way, as some people want, to have a geographic limit, because the terrorists certainly don't limit themselves geographically. But as far as a time limit, as long as it's, I mean, you can't do it every 2 years. As you all know, we don't pass a budget every year, and we're trying to. So it's got to be 5 years or some sort of extended period of time. But I just want to emphasize, if Elissa's daughter is out there for our country in a conflict, she needs to know that the whole country is behind her, not just the president, but that the whole country, and that is best manifested through an act of Congress, that the whole country is supporting this mission, and so that's part of the reason I believe that they deserve that. Is part of the reason I believe that it is so important. But let me just emphasize, we're talking about one particular AUMF here. When Clinton sent in troops into the whole Bosnia campaign, there was no authorization to use military force, and American forces died there. When Obama was doing assisting the Europeans in overthrowing Gaddafi, we were engaged in all sorts of ways, but there was no authorization for the use of military force there. As a matter of fact, I think every president since Truman has used military forces in some sort of conflict situation without having a congressional vote to ratify it. And that's part of the reason this issue that we were kind of talking about a little bit, what level of conflict is it that requires this whole of nation stamp of approval in a world where there's some sort of conflict going on all the time? And as we were talking, cyber even makes that more complicated. The key is, and I think we're in very much agreement, Congress has got to take steps to show that we can reclaim some of that authority that the Constitution puts in us. But we need to do it in a responsible way, and we need to do it in as nonpartisan a way as we possibly can. That's the only way that it's going to be effective.
We are out of time. Please join me in thanking the panel. I tried to explain that at the beginning, but I didn't do a good job.